Appreciate everybody who has been able to join here in the first couple of minutes. We have a big agenda to get through, a lot of information, as you might expect with any webinar with inflation in the title, but it'll all be good stuff. So thanks for joining us. I'm Jonathan Knopf, the Director for Programs here at Housing Forward Virginia. We're very glad to have all of you with us today to try as best we can to get inflation to make sense for housing folks just like you, practitioners, advocates, service providers, local officials, program administrators. Inflation affects everybody. So what is it and what can we do about it? Right now, if you hear some background noise and wondering why there's a cinder block wall behind me, I'm joining you from the Stanton Augusta Waynesboro Housing Summit that I think just wrapped up on the other side of the wall here. And something that I think I knew but was confirmed in one of the presentations was that this market, the Stanton Augusta Waynesboro market, is one of the tightest in the state. The days on market, average days on market for homes is about 6 days or less. So that's really tight. And so of course it's hard to buy a home when there's basically none that you can find, let alone afford, even if you can find one. And we know that inflation, there's a lot contributing to those conditions, but inflation is one of those, and it's certainly not making things any better. So we have two experts here with us today who will try to unpack exactly what is going on and what we can do about it. So I want to thank our speakers, Sonya Waddell from the Richmond Fed and Michael Urban from Virginia Housing. We greatly appreciate them being here with us today to share their expertise and knowledge. I also want to thank our sponsors, Virginia Housing, the Williamsburg Health Foundation, the Bob and Anna Lou Shaberg Foundation, and the Virginia Realtors. We're very grateful for their support to let us find the time to do things like this and try to teach our audience about some pretty complicated concepts and issues that definitely take more than an hour to really make sense of, but we'll do our best today to figure out as much as we can. So we'll get started first by hearing from Sonya. She'll talk about what inflation is and its relationship to housing and how it's influenced. Then Mike will talk about what Virginia Housing is doing and the tools that they have and are creating to help homebuyers in Virginia today deal with our market currently when inflation for the past few years has been as much as it has, let alone interest rates at the same time, which are connected as we'll hear about. So after their presentations, we'll have a Q&A session where you can ask questions, and we'll try to get to all of the ones that are submitted by you all. If we don't, we will share the questions with the panelists afterwards, and we'll see if they can just provide us with some typed responses, and we'll share that with all the attendees following the event, along with the recording and their slides. So yes, the slides will be shared. You don't have to worry about trying to take screenshots or anything. Just stay tuned in your inbox for a follow-up email from us in the coming days. I also have my colleagues working very hard in the background, Eric Mai and Rhea Doherty. They're here just to help with logistics and to run the show, which you need about 3 people to run a successful Zoom webinar, I think. So I'm really grateful that they can be here today, and they'll do their best to address any technical issues that folks may have that pop up. So thank you all again for joining us. Appreciate you all being here, and we'll get started. And Sonya, I will turn it over to you to introduce yourself a little more formally and share your presentation with us.
Sounds great. Thank you so much, Jonathan. Let me make sure I can share first. It worked well before, so hopefully it will still work. I appreciate the opportunity to come and talk to you all. You are on the ground trying to make housing work for people in Virginia. So I appreciate that. I'm going to talk about sort of inflation, really, and sort of how housing fits into that. I have been at the Federal Reserve Bank of Richmond since January of 2008, so 2 months before Bear Stearns collapsed. For many years, I was doing economic update presentations or outlook presentations, not even including anything about inflation. That obviously would not work very well for the last 3 years. So I hope that I'm going to answer any questions with the presentation, but it's going to be sort of macro. So please do ask questions, and I look forward to getting those. Of course, both in the presentation and in the questions, any views are mine and not the views of the Federal Reserve Bank of Richmond or the Federal Reserve System. So I'm going to assume that you can see my slides unless somebody yells out on the Zoom. So I want to talk about sort of what is inflation. Again, this is all in 15 minutes. Talk about like sort of what is inflation, how is housing cost or rent growth incorporated into inflation, a little bit about why the cost of housing has risen, and I have a feeling there are people on this call who can speak to that, better than I can. And then what does that mean for affordability? And I want to talk a little bit about affordability, even outside of the conversation of inflation. So we actually are transitioning a new research associate in my unit. And I asked for a slide with the inflation numbers. And he included the PPI, which I thought was, at first I was like, I would normally just do PCE and CPI, but I actually think that this was a good move. So I am going to kind of describe all three of these measures, and the purple one is going to be relevant in a few slides. So these are like the most common, the blue and the red are the most common measures of inflation. The CPI, for sure, the consumer price index is the one that is most commonly used. Partly that's because it comes out first. So we have April data for the CPI. We don't get April data for the PCE, which is the other major one, that blue line, personal consumption expenditures index. We don't get that until tomorrow, actually. But let me start with this red line, the CPI. So in all of these, this is year over year percent change. So we think about inflation, we're not actually talking about the price level, we're talking about the change in prices. And the target of the Federal Open Market Committee is 2% growth in the price level. So that is sort of target inflation is 2%. You don't want high inflation. You don't want highly variable inflation, or consumers and investors and firms can't plan, right? But you also don't want deflation, which is why they sort of landed on this 2% target. That red line, the CPI, is again the best known, developed by the Bureau of Labor Statistics. It's urban focused, so it looks at sort of a basket of goods in urban areas and then weights them appropriately. The weights of sort of what people are buying are updated annually, and I'm going to talk about that. That's actually an important difference between the CPI and the PCE. And it includes only out-of-pocket spending made directly by consumers. That's another important difference between the CPI and the PCE. So the PCE, that's the dark blue line, that's personal consumption expenditures index, uses all consumers. This is the one that's used more commonly by monetary policymakers. So while the CPI is used by sort of government agencies, a lot of things are sort of linked to CPI. PCE is what our monetary policymakers use, and partly it's because it uses all consumers. Partly it's because it uses this BEA data, which is a little different from BLS. And partly it's because it actually includes more types of spending. Like, it also includes spending made on consumers' behalf, like health insurance paid by employers or spending by nonprofits on a household's behalf. So it's not just out-of-pocket spending directly made by consumers. But importantly, the PCE also changes weights monthly. So, if beef prices go up and we as consumers switch from beef to chicken, then chicken would be it would be a higher weight in the PCE. I mean, it's a simple example, but the weights are changed monthly, which is actually part of the reason why you usually see the PCE below the CPI, which is what you see here. So when we look at sort of that 2% inflation target, that is a PCE inflation target. But, if you go back, you're looking at 2013, 2014, the PCE and the CPI are pretty close together and around 2%, in an ideal world. So, the story is really not different. It's kind of, what you think fits best for what you're looking for. The PPI is the producer price index. So that's actually the average. This is the change over time in the selling prices received by domestic producers for their output. So it's not from the consumer or the purchaser perspective, it's from the perspective of the seller, which could look different. And it looks a little bit different here, right? I mean, it could be different due to subsidies, sales or excise taxes. You could have distribution costs. This is also, it could include like intermediate goods, right? So it's not necessarily just final goods. It also includes goods that are sold to other businesses, not just directly to consumers. So, and like the pricing dynamics, depending on the market can differ. I'm going to talk about the PPIs related to construction costs later. So that's kind of where we are, right? And Jonathan said, inflation's gone up. When I said I didn't talk about inflation for a while, you look from 2011 to 2019 and we're pretty much, around that 2% target. Importantly, inflation is not sectoral price changes. So these charts, I don't think are updated to the most recent data, but that's fine because it's not the point, right? So the top left is the average price of eggs, right? And I don't know, you might remember, I certainly remember from the grocery store that egg prices soared around this time last year in 2023. Lumber prices soared, that's the bottom right, in the summer of 2021. That doesn't like a change in a single good price is not the same as inflation. So these price changes are not always easy to deal with. But they're actually a natural response to scarcity. So for egg prices, you had an outbreak of avian flu. So you had supply go down, but demand stayed the same. So price went up. Lumber, there was really high demand in 2020 and 2021. Then there were shipping delays of wildfires. And so there were sort of demand side and supply side issues. So when we think about housing, a change in the price of housing, like, in 2005, 2006, that doesn't necessarily mean that we see inflation. But there are some components of inflation that are tracked carefully, right? And one of those is housing, is the cost of housing. Okay, so this chart is it takes sort of core goods. So it takes out food and energy. So one measure that our policymakers look at is sort of in core inflation, right? So that's inflation without food and energy. They're not doing that because they're saying consumers don't spend on food and energy. They do it because there are dynamics in food and energy that aren't that monetary policy might not be able to address. And I'm happy to talk about that. But so this is kind of core goods is that red line. The blue line is core services without housing. And then the purple line is core services without housing. And then the blue line is housing. And these are like sort of the major components of that inflation number. And I'm going to describe this a little bit more. But what I want to point out here is that if you look from, the beginning of this chart, so 2007 to like 2020, 2021, you see actually sort of deflationary pressure from goods price growth, right? So that red line is sort of at or below zero. Then starting in 2021, that is what sort of drove the first inflation that we saw. So I can break this down further. I don't, because I'm already sort of past the time that I want to spend. But you can break this down further and look at what that core goods is. In 2021, that growth was almost entirely new and used cars. So we all might remember the chip shortage, or when you're driving by a car lot and there was nothing available. That was, partly because of that. Well, it was almost entirely because of the supply chain challenges that we were facing. So it wasn't actually crazy in 2021 to think that those supply chain challenges, particularly in chips, was driving that price growth. And then once that evened out, we would see a decline in inflation. But then we started to see core services price growth pick up, and we started to see housing price growth pick up. And where we are now, where we've been for the last year or so, is that the upward pressure on inflation is coming from core services and from housing. So, I'm not going to sort of belabor this difference between the CPI and the PCE, but if you're looking at these two indexes and kind of seeing a difference, I talked about the weights that the PCE updates monthly, and the CPI updates annually, but actually it's kind of dated even annually. I talked about sort of what's included in these two measures, but the weights also are different because they're based on different surveys. And you can see here that most recently CPI is like 40%, like 40% of that CPI. If you're looking at CPI inflation, 40% of that basket that we're looking at is housing, right? So if housing is going up more, we're going to see CPI going up more than PCE. It's still over 20% of the PCE number, but it's not as big. It doesn't have as big of a weight as it does in CPI. Okay, so then like how do we think about sort of the weights, like the shares and and sort of the price changes, right? So both of these matter. Those weights that we looked at before, that 40% versus 20%, the weights matter, and the price change matters. So, imagine a world where we have apples and bananas, right? Or imagine where we only have apples, right? And you see the price of apples go up. Well, then the price of that's all you buy, that's your inflation, right? Apples goes up. But like if you buy only one apple and 14 bananas in your basket of goods, then a change in the price of bananas is going to matter a lot more than the change in the price of apples, right? So I know that some of you, I don't know like how, but sometimes it's kind of easier to break it down a little bit and sort of to understand why those weights matter and how housing sort of fits into the bigger picture of inflation. So inflation is the weighted average of the changes in this apple and banana world, of changes in the price of apples and bananas. In the real world, there are, of course, a lot of prices, and there are a lot of very smart people in government statistical agencies and outside who are coming up continually with ways to measure these in a consistent way. You've got to control for quality. A TV today is not necessarily the same as what a TV was 40 years ago. Control for portion sizes. We all see this in the grocery store too, right? That what used to be the ice cream size has definitely gone down, much to the chagrin of my household. Or other, characteristics. So we have people sort of paying attention to that. Okay, so if we think about that share and the price change, we get to this sort of a chart, and this is like a similar chart to the one that I showed before. So the dark line here is headline PCE. The dark dotted line is core PCE, but let's look at headline because we have energy in here. The colors are the contribution of each of these pieces of that PCE to overall growth. Right? And you can see what I talked about before. Goods was a huge contributor to inflation into 2021, into 2022. But then it really shifted more to services, back actually to kind of the way it was before, right? But also shelter. And so when we think about shelter, this is not, we can talk about house prices, and I will, but shelter in the inflation numbers is the cost, like, it's not like what you buy a home for, it's how much you have to pay to consume the services of that shelter. And so it's rent, but it's also sort of an owner equivalent rent, right? So if you own your home, how much would you pay to rent that? And both of those are a part of this sort of measure of rent within the inflation numbers. And again, this is a PCE. It would look virtually the same with CPI. It would just be sort of scaled a little bit differently. Okay, so, well, you can see here, right, that we've got this sort of big contribution of shelter to inflation. I will say that you can see that it's kind of flattened out, right? So with this latest, I don't know if I was actually even going to talk about this, but with the latest CPI report that we got, maybe a few weeks ago, last week, that core services is kind of going down, right? But shelter inflation, that contribution has not changed that much. The expectation, though, is that we see that start to come down, and that's because of this, right? So the blue line is that owner's equivalent rent that I talked about. What would it cost? What would you pay to sort of rent your home? The red line is rent of shelter. But those are sticky, right? So leases don't get renewed every month. And landlords are not going to like kind of reduce the rent growth. They're maybe if it goes up 4% or 6%, then they're not going to say, okay, they're not going to renew that monthly, right? They're going to sort of do that over a year. But if you look at sort of or a few years, if you look at market-based measures of new tenant rent though, or this new tenant rent index, we've seen that start to come down. So once that starts to come down, then after that the owner's equivalent rent and rent of shelter are likely to come down. So that rent is gonna like the decline in that blue and that red line will put downward pressure on inflation. If that keeps coming down, it's going to help get inflation back to the 2% target. Now, the shares matter a ton, right? So if you look at, we've seen episodes of rents going up, of house prices going up, without seeing inflation, right? So that share that housing is in the inflation number matters a lot to how much it contributes to the decline in inflation to get back to the 2% target. So we have made, I'm sorry, I'm like jumping around here though, but we've made a ton of progress, right? Back down to that 2% target, but we aren't there yet. And until we're there, our policymakers are not going to be comfortable moving, to changing rates, bringing down rates. Okay, so let me just, house prices, this is the US, it's Virginia, it's Richmond. We saw them peak. So in the US from the first quarter of 2021, 2022, house prices rose 21%. That is the largest reading year growth that we've seen since the data started to be collected. Virginia, same period, peaked 18%. In Virginia, we did see house price growth that was higher for the state on average in 2004, 2005. But not that much higher. So this is, we had a really sharp increase in house prices. In Richmond, we also saw that. And you can look at Virginia Beach, you can look at Northern Virginia, you can look at, basically any part of the state. Interestingly, so at the Richmond Fed, we spend a fair amount of time understanding what's happening throughout the state, not just in our metro areas or the places where it's easy to collect data, but in the more rural parts of the state. And this is a consistent theme that we've heard and seen, and that you all live out every day, which is this increase in house prices. So over the short run, we're likely to see sort of some downward pressure, but you can see this start to tick up again, right? And we see this in this Case-Shiller housing price index as well. Now, one of our economists has done some work looking at the correlation between the PCE housing component and the Case-Shiller home price index. And if that correlation sort of holds going into the future, we're going to see that in about a year to 15 months, we're going to start to see that PCE housing component sort of pick up again. So while we expect it to come down, it's going to start to pick up again. Why? Because house prices are picking up, which means that owner's equivalent rent is going to pick up. And then you think, okay, well, are we going to see some downward pressure on house prices? So this is vacant housing units for sale since the late 1960s. We are at a number of vacant units for sale. So that's 730,000 vacant units for sale in the first quarter of 24. And that's the lowest we've seen since the early 80s, right? So, we have a larger population, we've got household formation. So this doesn't mean necessarily that housing costs have to grow a ton, but they're probably not going to be falling a lot either. And this is consistent with what we see in Virginia. The other thing that, like I said, I started at the Fed in the fall of in January of 2008. And that's when we started to see this sort of decline in construction activity, and it didn't really come back until 2020. Right now we've seen again this sort of decline in construction. It kind of picked up and now it's coming down again. The number of homes under construction is at its lowest reading in the last 2 years. It's still higher than pre-pandemic, but part of that is because of that increased time to build. Completions for multifamily in February, this is single family, but for multifamily, seem to have reached a peak in February. And so we've seen that come down. Construction activity is coming down. So the idea that we're going to be adding a ton to inventory is sort of hard to see based on some of these construction and pre-construction numbers that we're seeing now, as well as what we hear from builders in multifamily and single family. And I don't know if you all have noticed, but, with the increase in the target Fed funds rate that happened because of the inflation that we've seen, mortgage rates have gone up. I'm sure that's going to be new news to everybody on this call. Okay, so why part of the reason that we've seen this increase is because of we've got demand has gone up, the cost has gone up, right? But the cost of homes has also gone up because construction costs have gone up. So this is that producer price index for inputs related to construction. And this is services and goods, and that's gone up. And we know that that we've seen just an increase in construction costs, right? So if we see an increase in construction costs, we also know, and I'm going to jump through these slides because there's 2 slides away that I really want to make sure that I get to, and then I'll turn it over to Michael. So the construction is a big part of how much a home sells for, right? So there's profit, there's finished lot cost, and there's construction costs. And those construction costs have gone up a lot, haven't come back down. So if you look at a world where where construction costs have gone up, so it's more expensive to build. That cost means a lot to sales prices. Where we don't have a ton of new inventory coming on the market, it's hard to imagine that we're going to see prices come down a lot for the consumer. So what does that mean? It means that the share of income that the median household needs to buy a home has gone up a lot. So we had a conversation. This is like, this chart, that affordability threshold of 30%, right? So for years, the median income household could pay 30% of their income and buy the median priced home. Now, to buy the median priced home, they need between 40 and 45% of their income. Okay, so if you want to stick to that 30% threshold, now that, we're talking about inflation, so that 30% threshold, I actually heard a presentation the other day about where that came from. I never knew. But it's a I don't want to say it's a flawed measure, but it doesn't necessarily represent the experience of consumers everywhere, right? In that, I think about, like, if you have a $3 million income and you pay $1 million of that income on your home or on your monthly housing costs, that still leaves $2 million to buy food and to buy all of the, the other things that we need, healthcare. But if you have a $60,000 a year income and you pay, 40% of that, or more than 30% on your home, and you also see the price of other things, or on your housing services, I should say, and you also see the price of other things going up, that's tough. That's tough for consumers, and that's the world that a lot of people, a lot of people have been living in. So I want to, before I sort of wrap up and turn this over to Michael, I want to point out this measure that the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta does. It's a homeownership affordability measure. So this is a measure, the chart on the right, this is for Richmond, this is the Richmond MSA. And, a value lower than 100, so lower than that horizontal line, indicates that the median household income is insufficient to cover the annual costs of owning a median priced home, right? As in, it's more than 30, you have to pay more than 30% of income. Again, is that the right measure to use? I leave that to you all. But if you have an index of 100 or greater, then you can use your income to cover, use 30% of that to cover the costs of owning a median priced home. So what has happened in Richmond is actually pretty consistent across metro areas and, but really kind of throughout the country. And this is why when we go out and talk to people about workforce development or economic development or community development, one of the first things that comes up is sort of the cost of housing and the difficulty that people have sort of getting the housing that they need. So this does assume here, like you look at sort of this housing affordability monitor index, assumes that they're sort of paying the going mortgage rate and 10% down payment. So there is some PMI assumed. I think on average Americans, I read it was like 6% down payment. But anyway, so there is some PMI assumed in here. Okay, so this drop in Richmond. So if you look at March of 2020, so it was March to April of 2022. That's when Richmond fell below that horizontal line on the right. Median income from March to April of 2022 went up 0.7%. I could do an economic outlook presentation. We have seen wage growth. Absolutely. We've seen income growth, but so 0.7% in that month. Home prices went up 4.6% in that month, right? So wages have gone up, but they have not kept up with inflation, actually, even on the like food inflation, but also with the increase in the house prices. So actually, I mean, I shouldn't say that wage growth hasn't kept up with inflation. We've seen real wage growth. It just hasn't necessarily consistently kept up across income levels over the course of the last 2 years, but we have seen some pretty strong real wage growth across the income spectrum. The other thing that I want to say, like this is kind of fun to kind of dig into, and I don't have the link here, but I'm happy to provide it. It is interesting to look at different metro areas. Like if you look at Blacksburg, Pulaski County is affordable, Montgomery is not. Again, that really has something to do with the median income, but it has a lot to do with differences in the median home price. Okay, so I know I was speaking really quickly, but hopefully I repeated myself enough that I didn't lose too many people. So inflation is the growth in the price level for the overall basket of goods, right? It can't be unit like price by price, overall basket of goods. This inflation episode that started in 2021 really began with the increase in the price of goods, but now it's core services and it's shelter. So if you look at sort of housing and the CPI and the PCE, it's incorporated slightly differently. But either way, it tries to cover both ownership and rents. And that growth in shelter costs and an increase in its relative importance, has had an impact on inflation. And then, we can talk a little bit about why the cost of housing has risen, but let me go ahead and turn it over to Michael.
Thanks, Sonya. We gave you an impossible task, and you did a
too
terrific
long.
job.
Sorry,
It's so much information, and it certainly helps me really stitch together the narrative and the players and how it all comes together. So thank you very much. So Mike, why don't we turn it over to you to tell us what Virginia Housing is doing about that.
All right, absolutely. Thank you, Jonathan. Thank you, Sonya. I think you did a great job kind of highlighting the housing affordability realities that we're facing in this market. So hopefully I'll give some people on the call some hope of what's out there, what can be done to still buy a house in this market. So good afternoon, everyone. Again, I'm Mike Urban. I'm the Managing Director of Homeownership at Virginia Housing. Been here around 6 years. My bio was included in the email that went out, so I'm not going to spend time talking about myself, so I can dive into more about our presentation. I'm going to start to talk first about what we're doing at Virginia Housing to help Virginians attain quality affordable housing, and then I'll talk a little bit more about some of our specific programs in the homeownership division. All right, so Virginia Housing, we are the state's housing finance agency, and we have 3 main programmatic areas that support our mission. The first one's our rental division, who works with developers and offers flexible loans. They administer the low-income housing tax credit and look to finance multifamily housing properties. Our community outreach division works with our localities and our nonprofit housing partners to assess housing needs across the Commonwealth. And then our homeownership division that I oversee, we work with roughly 80 lenders across the state that originate Virginia housing loans on our behalf to make sure that our programs are available across the state. And then pictured here on the left-hand side here is a picture of one of our mobile mortgage offices. So we have a strategic lending team that is out driving these mobile mortgage offices to our more rural or underserved markets to making sure that our loan programs are available, even in our rural and more underserved areas. And then we also have an office in Waddell as well to make sure that we're serving our Southwest folks. So let me jump into some of our loan programs. So Sonya spoke about inflation, and while Virginia Housing can't change housing prices or interest rates, and that's not totally true, I'll talk about that here in a second. we have taken some actions to make it easier for folks to buy homes. So last year, we launched a mortgage revenue bond program, and this takes advantage of a private activity bond or tax-exempt bonds, which is really just fancy talk for how these programs are funded. In practicality, what it really means is it's a 25 basis point or a quarter interest rate reduction to our standard interest rates. We also expanded our income limits to help individuals with incomes up to 150% of area median income. So we've realized, and Sonya's slide just kind of highlighted it, that it's taking more income to qualify to be able to afford homes in this market. We also launched a First Home Dream program. This launched earlier this year, and this is for first-generation homebuyers in the Richmond MSA. Funding for this program is extremely limited, but it's allowing us to kind of dip our toes into the special purpose credit program for future opportunities. And then we made enhancements to our maximum debt to income ratios. So for the longest time, or forever really, we were capped at 45%, and recently we've allowed that to go up to 50% of people's debt to income. And Sonya, I think your affordability slide really kind of highlighted that more people over the last, specifically the 2.5 years, are needing to stretch their incomes more to buy a home in this market. And from what we're seeing in our loans that are coming in, is about 50% of our loans have debt to income ratios around 40 to 50%. So again, people are just having to stretch more to buy a home. And then our specialty programs, this is really why borrowers are coming to Virginia Housing. This is our secret sauce of what people need from us. 98% of our loans last year utilized one of these programs or multiple. So we have down payment assistance grants. These are true grants, forgivable at closing, and it's 2 to 2.5% of the sales price. And these are paired with a conventional or an FHA loan. We have closing cost assistance grants. So with our VA loans or rural development loans that do not require a down payment, we can give up to 2% to help with those closing costs. And then for people that need a little bit of additional assistance or maybe over our grant income limits, we have a plus second mortgage. So this is a 30-year amortized mortgage that goes along with your first at the same interest rate, but it will cover your full down payment. And then for some borrowers, it can cover 1.5% of closing costs as well. So really trying to make the amount of money that our customers are bringing to closing, we're trying to minimize that to help them get into their first home. And then we have a program called SPARK, or Sponsoring Partnerships and Revitalizing Communities. Remember I said we can't really change interest rates? Well, that's what SPARK does. It's a 1% rate reduction to our posted interest rates. And this graph here is just illustrating some of our income and sales price limits that are currently tied to our programs. The first 4 buckets that you'll see are tied to our mortgage revenue bond programs, or the program that has a quarter interest rate reduction from our standard programs. And you can see we have grant limits. So if you're looking in Richmond, it's $86,000. It's a little bit lower than the 107. So if you're under 86,000 and you have a household of 2 or fewer in the Richmond market, you would be eligible or could possibly be eligible for one of our grants with your program. And then a little further over in that 5th column is our expanded limits that goes up to 150% of area median income. And again, that was just, we knew there was a need for people. It's not just the lower income folks anymore that are having a hard time buying homes. So that's why we expanded those programs. And then on the right-hand side are our standard purchase price limits that are tied to our mortgage revenue bond programs. So at Virginia Housing, we want to be a resource to our partners to assist with any homeownership initiatives they may be developing. So a few examples that I want to cite for y'all are, we worked with Henrico County and the city of Richmond on, they created an employer-assisted housing program. And what this is, it's a down payment assistance for their employees. We also partnered with or participated in a partnership for housing affordability event last year, which on the topic of employer assisted housing, to make sure that we are raising awareness and that employers could use this as a tool to attract or retain potential employees as well. We've worked to help our lending partners to be able to finance more properties or educate them on financing options for some properties like community land trusts and affordable dwelling units. And we've worked with some of our partners to help increase housing stock in their communities. And I'll have a slide on that as well that I'll talk about. And then our business development team hosts a ton of trainings to educate our partners on our programs, but they have one specifically that's entitled Treasures in Your Backyard that highlights our down payment resources and how they can be stacked with other resources as well. And so what you can see here is just kind of an example of one of the things highlighted in Treasurer's Backyard and just how down payment assistance programs can be stacked or layered. And this is just one example, but in this example, the home buyer is taking advantage of our down payment assistance grant, also taking advantage of a federal home loan bank grant and our Spark program, which reduces that interest rate by 1%. So if you broke down the math of this without that additional federal home loan bank grant or the interest rate reduction with Spark, the principal and interest payment on this borrower's loan would be around $1,230. But with this additional assistance, with the federal home loan bank grant, with Spark, that payment is reduced by about $115 a month because of these additional savings. So that payment would be around $1,115 a month. So helping our partners understand that there are other opportunities available is really important. And this is why we do it is because we love promoting our programs and love promoting these resources. And just last week, and I thanked our business development training manager for this little nugget, we got an email from one of our loan officers giving credit to one of our business development officers about this. And I'm going to directly read her quote, but it says, "I'm sure you hear this all the time, but Gigi is the best representative of Virginia housing you have. I would not be a top producing loan officer without her guidance." So, and that's because Gigi recently gave this loan officer a list of local agencies that had grant money. And from that list, she was able to close a client with a $60,000 Norfolk grant. And she's got another applicant or client in the process with a $25,000 Chesapeake grant. So this is why our team is out promoting our programs and the other available resources that are available to help buyers in this market buy homes. So I talked briefly about supporting inventory. So while we can't change home prices, we're working to help make sure that we can help increase housing supply. So pictured on the left here is a program that we've partnered with DHCD, the Department of Housing and Community Development, to put together. It's called Acquire, Renovate, Sell. So DHCD is administering this program. They are working with housing nonprofit partners across the Commonwealth, and they will provide funding for these partners to acquire a property, renovate it, and then sell it to an income qualified individual. So this is one small way that we're working with partners to make sure that we're taking housing stock that's out in the communities, maybe not in a habitable condition, getting it rehabbed and getting it back onto the open market. Pictured in the middle here is Ms. Terrell in front of her 3D printed home. This home is in Richmond. And we had a few partners on this, but we're also currently working with Virginia Tech to see if we can bring more of this technology to Virginia to have more 3D printed homes here. And then on the right here is Ms. Bullock, Tanisha Bullock, in her brand new manufactured home. We see manufactured homes as a great housing option, great affordable housing option, and the technology or the way these homes are built have improved greatly over the years. We've brought several manufactured homes to the governor's housing conferences over the last few years to help people walk through them, to get people to go through them and see what they are like and to see the quality. And it's really great to see people walk through these homes and the surprise of, wow, this is much nicer than I really thought it was. And then also multifamily housing duplexes are being introduced very shortly, and you'll see some of these coming out in Virginia in the near future. So another way, another affordable housing option that's out there. So in preparing for this presentation, Jonathan asked me to just pull some data together on how we're stacking up against median, the statewide sales prices that we're seeing out there. So according to Virginia Realtors, median sales price in Virginia is around 400,000, and currently for us it's around 260. You can see there's a pretty big difference on the households that we're serving. And then to highlight some of the changes that we've seen over the years, our median sales price in 2020 was around $200,000. So we're up $60,000 in our median sales price over those 4 years. Interest rates, I'm sure most of you know this on the call, they've roughly doubled over that time frame. And the median payment in 2020 was a little over $900. And today we're seeing it a little over $1,600. So a $700 a month increase that we've seen in the median payment. Now we're also seeing an increase in our median income, or our median borrower income. So we're up about $14,000 in median borrower income over that time frame. That's not saying that everyone's income is increased. I mean, it is possible that we're just serving higher income individuals over that time, but we are seeing an increase in our income as well. So really the point of this information is just to highlight that even in this market, even with home prices up, even with interest rates up, even with limited inventory, we are still helping people buy homes in this market. And then I just like to show what some of these homes look like. These are very nice, beautiful homes. I'm not going to talk about any of the specifics here or any of the actual homeowners, but these are really nice homes that our first-time buyers are getting into. So I'm just really proud of what our home buyers are doing and where they're buying. So Jonathan, I'm about to turn it back over to you. And if people have an interest in finding out more about Virginia housing or getting our updates, I know you're sending the presentation out, so they're not going to have to scan this QR code live, but this is how you can sign up for our website or for our announcements to find out more information about what we're doing.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Mike. So we've got probably 10 solid minutes for questions, and I see a couple in the chat. And so the first one is for you, Michael. Can you explain the difference between bonded and non-bonded loans? Also, are most of the grants that you spoke about reserved specifically for first-time buyers or not?
Okay, so I'm gonna go in reverse order if you don't mind. The grants, yes, are for first-time home buyers. They are not eligible for non-first-time home buyers. There are some minor exceptions to that. I'd prefer not to get to the weeds in a bigger format, so you could reach out to us afterwards and we can get into those specifics. The other question was kind of the difference between our mortgage revenue bonds or bonded loans and non-bonded. I believe for the most simple terms, that's just the funding source of how we fund our loans. There are more restrictions with mortgage revenue bond loans, first-time home buyers, income limits apply, and there's a discounted interest rate that can go with that. But that's the very high-level specifics of it. It's just the funding source for our programs.
Got it. Thank you. And we've got the next question here from a couple of folks at Field Studio, and I'm going to just kind of summarize them in a second, but Sonya, I'll ask you to address this one first, maybe to give Mike a chance to read it and see if there's anything he'd like to add. But they hit the nail on the head that, one of the big reasons why, inventory is low is that it's not easy to build homes at scale in Virginia always, particularly homes that might be smaller or more affordable. And that's due to a lot of reasons, but local land use and zoning and development regulations play a role. And we're seeing a lot of great progress to change that across the state, but it'll take a lot of time. So at least from the Fed's perspective, is there anything that you think you could do to encourage or further study or determine what is possible to do about the time and energy it takes to build? Are there, offsite production solutions like manufactured housing that that you see, the Fed supporting or educating folks about.
Yeah, I mean, so I don't know if they actually meant the Fed is in the Federal Reserve or the Fed is in sort of, the federal government. But one of the things I talked about that goods price, the goods inflation. So we've seen productivity in manufacturing, productivity improvements in manufacturing for decades now, particularly in the 90s, 2000s. We haven't seen that as much in the housing sector, right? So we haven't seen sort of labor productivity. We build houses now a lot in the same way we did, 50 years ago. But, and Mike was talking about this, manufactured housing or modular housing, 3D printed housing, in terms of like policy or sort of data wise, I don't see any of this, but we have sort of, as we go out and talk to people, sort of understand what's happening on the ground. We've seen some really interesting examples of productivity improvements that have not been done at scale yet, but that are ways to build homes more cheaply than we've been able to do it. But I don't know what Virginia Housing is doing, or if there's some particular things going on in Virginia to address that.
Yeah, Mike, you want to add whatever you can on this one?
Yeah, I'm happy to talk about it. So we've done a couple things. We try and do projects to show, or we try and highlight concepts that other parties can take and bring to a bigger scale. So we look to prove a concept. So in Danville, we did a project with Next Step that worked with manufactured homes. There's a new variation of manufactured homes called the Cross Mod. There's some additional requirements to them, but they're a next level manufactured home where they brought in manufactured home for infilling city lots. There's been several projects across the country using these cross mods to build neighborhoods and other infill. So I think that is one opportunity. There's a LIHTC project using these down in Petersburg that we're involved with. So I think there's a lot of opportunities with manufactured housing or cross mods specifically. We did a project in Martinsville with modular housing. So just again, trying to highlight another, reduced cost opportunity for housing that could be done. And I talked about the 3D printed home. There's a group in Austin called Icon. They've partnered with DR Horton. They've got a complete neighborhood of 3D printed homes. And that's where you can get it to the scale. And that's what we're hoping to see with 3D printed homes. These homes can be printed around the clock. They're on tracks. So you just need as many lots as you can in a line, and you can keep going. That's where I see some big scale opportunities.
Thank you. Let's see, we have one question just pop in a second ago. Do you think the lock-in effect of mortgage costs is sufficiently large to constrain the supply of existing homes that are for sale? So people got the 2-point-something interest rates, low threes. Yeah, it's definitely an incentive not to move with where rates are now. So Mike or Sonya, do you want to speak to that phenomenon, and if you think that may be changing anytime soon?
Yeah, I'll start and then turn it over to Mike. So I talked about the inventory of homes for sale. I think that lock-in effect is absolutely relevant to that, right? But then if we start to see, say when we start to see mortgage rates come down and we see people moving more who kind of got a mortgage rate, 5-10 years ago, we're also going to see, so we'll see some supply come on, but we also might see an increase in demand, right, for housing. So what the net effect is going to be on the amount, on the cost of housing, is a little hard to say. And actually, John Otrikun, one of our economists, we have this Macro Minute blog. He wrote something on that, I think, pretty recently. But I think that is absolutely relevant to the inventory that we have right now.
Yeah, I would echo that and agree that yes, there is some effect by this. People are locked in. They're going to want to stay in their house a little bit longer. with the reduced interest rate. Also looking at if I sell my home and yes, I'm going to make money, but where am I going to buy is doing that. But I will say that life still happens. Families get larger. So people will still move. They will break their 2% mortgage, 3% mortgage to buy a different house or to move to a different school. And this is about a year ago, but I was at a presentation by someone from the MBA, and they said around their prediction is when rates get to around 5%, and where we're at right now, who knows where this comes, maybe that number changes since this is a year old. There's going to be some time where that threshold or that tolerance of where rates are, people are okay with the change. I mean, if you need to move for house reasons, people are going to do that.
Thank you. All right, so another question popped in. Have you seen if there are any jurisdictional restrictions that prohibit or address 3D printed homes? So I think there definitely could be, and I think this also ties perhaps in the state building code. I don't want to put my colleagues Eric and Maria on the spot, but they've been doing a lot of zoning work. So if they've seen anything related to 3D printing in local zoning codes across the state, if they could just put it in the chat, maybe to share. But Mike, from your experience with the 3D homes that Virginia Housing has supported, was overcoming local barriers or anything in building code a significant challenge?
No, is the simple answer. So all this is a piece of technology that's being used to build the home. This is a cement home, just like a cinder block home. So there is some education components with localities around the building code and how this fits in, but it's a regular built home. And on the financing piece as well, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac have actually put out guidance to say that these types of homes are allowable to be financed. So they've even called this out, that there's nothing unique here. It's just a technology that's being used to build homes.
Got it. Thank you. Sonya, I want to ask you a question that I've had in the back of my mind. So, the thing that everybody listens to on the news or, eagerly awaits is, what's going to happen with rates, right? Are they going to go up and down? Is the Fed ever going to cut, et cetera? So we know that they, consider that whole basket of goods and all sorts of other economic data. And I know you don't have access to whatever crystal ball they may use, but could you maybe just kind of hypothesize or share your thoughts on how they incorporate shelter costs and housing market trends into their deliberations about what to do with rates?
Sure. So, I mean, they definitely do. I'll say two things to this. One is, they're just like food and energy. There are dynamics that we've talked about a lot today, in sort of the cost of shelter that are not directly in the control of monetary policy. So they look at headline inflation, they look at core inflation, which is stripping out food and energy. But now there's also this super core that came in, which is stripping out food, energy, and housing, right? So to understand sort of what does inflation look like without some of the components that monetary policy can't directly control. But then they look at headline as well. So that shelter component is important to how we think about sort of inflation coming down. But then you think about it sort of over the longer run too, right? So it's not just about that, like, kind of looking at sort of shelter's contribution to inflation now, but it's, what might we see in a year? How much do we need to see that shelter component come down in order to get inflation back to the 2% target? So, I think they're taking into account all of these factors. I do think that, like I said before, when we think about sort of the impact of long-term interest rates or mortgage rates on the economy in a variety of ways, their number one, and I say this not, as somebody who works at the Fed, but as somebody who reads the newspaper, right, and who looks at the speeches of, their number one priority is to get inflation back to 2%. So yes, they are thinking about what will be the impact on the housing market, on commercials, on anything, if and when they start to lower rates. But the primary goal right now is to get back to that 2% target.
Got it. Thank you. Yeah, I guess all I can say is I'm glad that's not my job to figure that out. So it's 101. I want to thank both of our panelists here and everybody who attended, and Eric and Maria who were working in the background to make sure things ran smoothly, and they did. So great job, everybody. Thanks again for your time over the past hour. And I saw one question just pop in from Phil Stodio folks again, but we do need to wrap up. So we'll get this question to the speakers and make sure their responses and any other follow-up notes or comments they have, in addition to their presentations, are sent out along with the recording and their contact info in the coming days. So greatly appreciate everybody's time and hope you enjoy the rest of your afternoons. Take care.